Another staunch upholder of the Avesta was the numismatologist Tychson, who, having begun to read the book, with the prejudice against its authenticity, quitted it with the conviction to the contrary. "There's nothing in it," he said, "which befits remote ages and a man philosophizing in the infancy of the world." Well, bar for the infancy. Seems that the secondary thinkers have more of the problems than the primary ones, but such traces of a recent period as they fancy to have found in it are either understandings or belong to its later portions, the editings of the various ages and the revivals. On the whole, there is a marvelous accordance between the Zend Avesta and the accounts of the ancients with regard to the doctrine and institutions of Zoroaster. Plutarch agrees so well with the Zend books that I think no one will deny the close resemblance of doctrines and identity of origin. Add to all this the incontrovertible argument to be drawn from the language, the antiquity of which is established by the fact that it was necessary to translate a part of the Zend books into Pahlavi, a language which was obsolete as early as the time of the Sassanids. Lastly, it cannot be denied that Zoroaster left books which were, through centuries, the groundwork of the magic religion. Magic is in, spiritual art and science that, Christianity didn't accept. But aside from Christianity and Judaism, it was the big third religion available that people could look at, which were preserved by the Magi, as shown by a series of documents from the time of Hermippus. Therefore, I am unable to see why we should not trust the Magi of our days when they ascribe to Zoroaster those traditional books of their ancestors, in which nothing is found to indicate fraud or a modern hand. 2 years afterwards, in 1793, was published in Paris a book which, without directly dealing with the Avesta, was the first step taken to make its authenticity incontrovertible. It was the masterly memoir by Sylvester de Sacy, in which the Pahlavi inscriptions of the first Sassanids were deciphered for the first time and in the decisive manner. De Sacy, in his researches, had chiefly relied on the Pahlavi lexicon, published by Anquetil, whose work vindicated itself better than by heaping up arguments by promoting discoveries. The Pahlavi inscriptions gave the key, as is well known, to the Persian cuneiform inscriptions, which were in return to put beyond all doubt the genuineness of the Zend language. Tychson, in an appendix to his commentaries, pointed to the importance of the new discovery. This, he writes, is a proof that Pahlavi was used during the reign of the Sassanids, for it was from them that these inscriptions emanated, as it was by them, nay, by the first of them, Ardashir Babagan, that the doctrines of Zoroaster was revived. One can now understand why the Zend books were translated into Pahlavi. Here, too, everything agrees and speaks loudly for their antiquity and genuineness. About the same time, Sir William Jones, then president of the Royal Asiatic Society, which he had just founded, resumed in a discourse delivered before that society the same question he had solved in such an offhand manner 20 years before. He was no longer the man to say, "Sied il a un hame ne dans se siècle de ses inventures de fables indiennes, and though he had still a spite against Anquetil, he spoke of him with more reserve than in 1771. However, his judgment on the Avesta itself was not altered on the whole, although, as he himself declared, he had not thought it necessary to study the text, but a glance at the Zend glossary published by Anquetil suggested to him a remark which makes Sir William Jones, in spite of himself, the creator of the comparative grammar of Sanskrit and Zend. When I perused the Zend glossary, he writes, I was inexpressibly surprised to find that 6 or 7 words in 10 are pure Sanskrit, and even some of their inflections borne by the rules of Vyakaran, just as Yush Macham, the genitive plural of Yushmad, now Anquetil most certainly, and the Persian compiler most probably had no knowledge of Sanskrit, and could not, therefore, have invented a list of Sanskrit words. It is, therefore, an authentic list of Zend words, which has been preserved in books, or by tradition. It follows that the language of the Zend was at least a dialect of the Sanskrit. Those same 5 tribes, so. Approaching perhaps as nearly to it as the Prakrit are other popular idioms, which we now know to have been spoken in India 2,000 years ago. This conclusion that Zend is a Sanskrit dialect was incorrect. The connection assumed to be too close. But it was a great thing that the near relationship of the 2 languages should have been brought to light. In 1798, Father Palo de Saint Barthélemy further developed Jones' remarks in an essay on antiquity of the Zend language. He showed its affinity with the Sanskrit by a list of such Zend and Sanskrit words as were least likely to be borrowed, those that designate the degrees of relationship, the limbs of the body, and the most general and essential ideas. Another list, intended to show on a specific topic how closely connected the 2 languages are, contains 18 words taken from the liturgic language used in India and Persia. This list was not very happily drawn up, as out of the 18 instances, there is not a single one that stands inquiry, yet it was a happy idea, and one which has not yet even yielded all that it promised. His conclusions were that in the far remote antiquity, Sanskrit was spoken in Persia and Media, and that it gave birth to the Zend language, and that the Zend Avesta is authentic. A language perhaps that resulted in both, but were it but a recent compilation, he writes, as Jones asserts, how is it that the oldest rites of the Parsis, that the old inscriptions of the Persians, the accounts of the Zoroastrian religion, in the classical writers, the liturgical prayers of the Parsis, and lastly, even their books do not reveal the pure Sanskrit as written in the land where the Parsis live, but a mixed language, which is as different from the other dialects of India as French is from Italian. This amounted, in fact, to saying that the Zend is not derived from the Sanskrit, but that both are derived from another, an older language. The Carmelite had a deep notion of that truth, but as he failed to express it distinctly, it was lost for years and had to be rediscovered. The first 25 years of this century, the 1800s, were void of results, but the old and sterile discussions as to the authenticity of the text continued in England in 1808 of the Common Era. John Leyden regarded Zend as a Prakrit dialect, parallel to Pali. Pali being identical with the Magadhi dialect, and Zend with the Saraceni. In the eyes of Erskine, Zend was a Sanskrit dialect, imported from India by the founders of Azdaism, but never spoken in Persia. His main argument was that Zend is not mentioned among the 7 dialects, which were current in ancient Persia, according to the Farhang-e-Jahangiri, and that Pahlavi and Persian exhibit no close relation with Zend. In Germany, miners had found no followers. The theologians appealed to the Avesta in their polemics, and Rhodes sketched the religious history of Persia after the translations of Anquetil. Erskine's essay provided a decisive answer from Emanuel Rask, one of the most gifted minds of the new school of philology, who had the honor of being a precursor of both Grimm and Bernauth. He showed the list of the Jahangiri referred to an epoch later than that which the Zend must have belonged, and to parts of Persia different from those where it must have been spoken. He showed further that the modern Persian is not derived from Zend, but from a dialect closely connected with it. And lastly, he showed, what was still more important, that Zend was not derived from Sanskrit. As to the system of its sounds, Zend approaches Persian rather than Sanskrit, and as to its grammatical forms, if they often remind one of Sanskrit, they are often reminded one of Greek and Latin, and frequently have a special character of their own. Rask also gave the paradigm of 3 Zend nouns belonging to different declensions, as well as the right pronunciation of the Zend letters, several of which had been incorrectly given by Anquetil. This was the first essay on the Zend grammar, and it was a masterly one. The essay was published in 1831 of the Common Era by Peter von Bohlen on the origin of the Zend language. Through the matter, 40 years back, according to him, Zend is a Prakrit dialect, as it had been pronounced by Jones, Leyden, and Erskine. His mistake consisted in taking Anquetil's transcription of the words, which are often so incorrect as to make them look like corrupted forms when compared with Sanskrit. And, what was worse, he took the proper names in their modern Parsi forms, which often led him to comparisons that would have appalled Menange. Thus, Ahriman became a Sanskrit word, Ahriman, which would have meant the fiend. Yet, Bohlen might have seen in Anquetil's work itself that Ahriman is the modern form of Angra Mainyu, words which hardly remind one of the Sanskrit Ahriman. Again, the angel Bohumana, our good thought, was reduced by means of the Parsi form Bahman to the Sanskrit Bahuman, a long-armed god. I don't know if you can necessarily throw the word God into the meaning of that. At last came Bernauth. From the time when Anquetil had published his translation, that is to say, during 70 years, no real progress had been made in knowledge of the Avesta text. The notion that Zend and Sanskrit are 2 kindred languages was the only new idea that had been acquired, but no practical advantage for the interpretation of the text had resulted from it. Anquetil's translation was still the only guide, and as the doubts about the authenticity of the text grew fainter, the authority of the translation became greater, the trust reposed in the Avesta being reflected on to the work of its interpreter. The Parsis had been the teachers of Enquitil, and who could ever understand the holy writ of the Parsis better than the Parsis themselves? There was no one who even tried to read the text by the light of Enquitil's translation to obtain a direct understanding of them. About 1825, Eugene Burnouf was engaged in a course of researches on the geographical extent of the Aryan languages in India. After he defined the limits which divide the races speaking Aryan languages from the native non-Brahmanical tribes in the south, he wanted to know of a similar boundary, if it had ever existed in the northwest, and if it is outside of India, that the origin of the Indian languages and civilizations are to be sought for. He was thus led to study the languages of Persia, and, first of all, the oldest of them was the Zend. But as he tried to read the text by help of Enquitil's translation, he was surprised to find that this was not the clue he had expected. He saw two causes had misled Enquitil. On the one hand, his teachers, the Parsi Dasturs, either knew little themselves or taught him imperfectly. Not only the Zend, but even the Pahlavi, intended to explain the meaning of the Zend, so that the tradition on which his work rested, being incorrect in itself, corrupted it from the very beginning. On the other hand, as Sanskrit was unknown to him, and comparative grammar did not as yet exist, he could not supply the defects of tradition by their aid. Now, perhaps it's not always an intention for the tradition to be corrupted, but let's face it, the conservativeness is more than just translating. Sometimes there's misunderstandings or oversimplifications or something, but let's not ignore the additions and subtractions when particularly a professional priesthood gets in charge. The faith of Zarathustra was something that everybody was supposed to be able to do on their own. Certainly involved the community, but, learning some basic prayers and all that sort of stuff, it could have been something they did on their own, but the priest extended and extended and extended until there were big, long rituals that basically only they could do, that were even required for the communal thing. It's like, oh, here's the communal fire, and we've gone through this, months and months of all these rituals with it. Burnouf, laying aside tradition as found in Enquitil's translation, consulted it as found in a much older and purer form, and a Sanskrit translation of the Yasna, made in the 15th century by the Parsi Naryosang, in accordance with the old Pahlavi version. The information given by Naryosang he tested, and either confirmed or corrected by comparison of parallel passages, and by the help of comparative grammar, which had just been founded by Bopp, and applied by him successfully to the explanation of Zend forms. Thus he succeeded in tracing the general outlines of the Zend lexicon, and in fixing its grammatical forms, he founded the only correct method of interpreting the Vesta. He also gave the first notions of comparative mythology of the Avesta and the Veda, by showing the identity of the Vedic Yama with the Avesta Yima, and of the Traitana with the Thra Eta Anna and Faridun. Thus, he made his commentaire sur la Yasna a marvelous and unparalleled model of critical insight and steady good sense, equally opposed to the narrowness of mind which clings to matters of fact without rising to their cause and connecting them with a series of associated phenomena, and to the wild and uncontrolled spirit of comparison, which by comparing everything confounds everything, never sacrificing either tradition to comparison or comparison to tradition. He knew how to pass from one to the other, and was so enabled both to discover facts and explain them. Let us not be fooled by a lot of these etymology tricks that people go into, that words have different lexicographical and literal meanings when you take them into different cultures. It may sound like the same word, but it's not quite the same thing. You know, daimon is not the same thing as demon or daemon. But people, you know, a lot of it is people are taking the spiritual thing out of it. Although, like anger in the Bible doesn't really say your anger, it says the nostrils flare. At the same time, the ancient Persian inscriptions at Persepolis and Behestun were deciphered by Burnouf in Paris, by Lassagne in Bonn, and by Sir Henry Rawlinson in Persia. This was revealed by the existence at the time of the first Achaemenid kings of a language closely connected with that of the Avesta, and the last doubts as to the authenticity of the Zend books were at length removed. It would have required more than an ordinary amount of skepticism to look still upon the Zend as an artificial language of foreign importation, without root in the land where it was written, and in the conscience of the people for whom it was written, at the moment when a twin language, bearing a striking likeness to it in nearly every feature, was suddenly making itself heard from the mouth of Darius, and speaking from the very tomb of the first Achaemenid king. That unexpected voice silenced all controversies and last echoes of the loud discussion which had been opened in 1771 died away unheeded. And of course, there's more to the study of religion than language, but language is certainly an aspect that gives us insight, isn't it?